Hello everyone and welcome back to The Analyst dated 19th of July. And today we are going to cover the following articles, out of which 3 of them are going to be extremely important for the upcoming mains examination. So what are these topics? Let's have a look. The first topic is going to be about the railway infrastructure and the related loopholes which have caused increased frequency of railway accidents in India. In the second one, we will read about how recently the Hathras incident has reignited the debate on the superstation and the lack of appropriate laws for the same in India. In the third one, we will do a deep editorial analysis on the issues with the existing tree plantation schemes across the world and in India. Then we will read about the overview of Finance Commission, as recently the 16th Finance Commission has begun its work. Then we will quickly have an overview of the Niti Aayog's report, which is about boosting and revitalizing the electronic sector in India. And finally, we will conclude by reading some of the very interesting prelims snippets extremely important for the prelims exam. So stay tuned. Our first topic is the prime highlight of the day. Here we are going to read about the railway accidents in India. So what is the context? Context is the very unfortunate derailment of about 8 coaches of a train which was moving from Chandigarh to Dibrugarh in the Gonda district of UP, which has resulted in many fatalities and injuries. Why are we reading about this? Because it pertains to GS3 part of the syllabus, where we have to read about the infrastructural issues related to India and the related governmental policies and measures in order to correct them. So we are going to cover both of these dimensions in this particular topic. First of all, now the Indian Railways, which boasts itself to be carrying the 4th largest railway network in the world and 1st largest railway network in Asia, is marked by a lot of loopholes because of rising frequency of accidents ever since its inception, that is right from the 19th century. Now, what are the primary reasons for these accidents? Now, before understanding the reasons, let us first understand the concerns. The gravity of the concern is such that the National Crime Records Bureau has reported in 2021 that about 16,000 overall deaths and 1,800 cases of injuries were directly coming from the railway accidents that happen in India. As you can see from the graph over here, that though we can see that from 2012, there have been a decline in the cases of railway accident, but the concern has remained pertinent. And this should not be there in the age of automation, in the age of Industrial Revolution 4.0. So now the first question that you should ask is, what are the primary causes? Well, according to the NCRB report, the primary causes in their decreasing order of frequency are, first of all, collisions. The second is derailment, which happened in this particular case. Then the level crossing accidents, more about it in the next slide. Some of the fires could be the reasons and other cases can also be there. So these are some of the cases highlighted by NCRB. But if we bring our attention more focusedly upon each one of them, the most primary reason is the infrastructural deficit that the Indian railways and the Indian infrastructure faces. How? First of all, it starts with having very, very poor tracks and poorly maintained tracks, bridges, coaches, etc. because they have been developed from the colonial times, back from 19th century, and to your surprise, not many of them have been retrofitted even till date. So therefore, the Indian railways are suffering from poor quality of tracks, poor maintenance of tracks and bridges. The next thing is vandalism. So because it is created and it is maintained by the government, so whenever somebody wants to put their aggression against the government, these kind of public properties becomes a favorite spot. So vandalism by the public, burning of the governmental properties. So these are the things which also leads to rise in the cases of accidents. Why? Because they compromise with the very quality of the railway infrastructure. The next one is natural disaster. Whereas we know that the hazard zonation of India has been done in line with the earthquake prone zones. But still, at many places, for example, Himalayas and Northeast and Western Ghats, most of them have been compromised, or the railway crossings have been compromised, the infrastructure have been compromised because they were not properly hazard zonated. So natural hazards like earthquake could be a very prominent reason as to why infrastructural defects gets inbuilt into the railway infrastructure. Next is the lack of funds. See, without money, nothing can prevail. Not even the retrofitting, not even the maintenance of the infrastructure will be made proper. And not only that, the very training of the manpower who's going to take care of this infrastructure, that is also going to get compromised. So lack of funds is one of the biggest miseries that is being faced by railway infrastructure and railway department. Next is that routes are operating at over 100% capacity. Now we are living in the age where the population is growing on rapidly, the freight amount is growing on rapidly, and as a result of this, the railways are also carrying something beyond their capacity. In order to maintain this capacity, we would require enough amount of automated updations, but that is not duly made in the railway infrastructure and is still managed by a lot of manpower which is not trained yet. So therefore, these are some of the infrastructural defects which can lead to many of the railway accidents. The next one are the human errors, which can be broadly classified into the ethical errors committed by humans and the technical or the training level errors created by humans. First of all, with regards to ethical errors, it could be, for example, siphoning of the funds, for example, doing corruption, negliging or basically disregarding the safety rules. This can be done by both the railway manpower and also by the plebeians, that is by the common people. And this leads to this negligence of the safety rules, this siphoning of the money and negligence of the overall railway safety. This can lead to a lot of accidents and this accident can turn into a major disaster. Second thing is wrong signaling. Wrong signaling, miscommunication and overspeeding can also be some of the errors which can be committed by the humans. These are coming into the technical category. So we have learned that broadly two kind of errors, ethical one and technical one, can be carried out by humans. This could be one of the reasons. Second is a signaling failure. Now this is non-human error but also involves human intervention to good extent, but this is regarding machine. So signaling errors because of technical glitches, because of power outages, etc., they can cause such accidents. You must remember that Balasore accident, which took place in the October last year, was because of the communication gap that happened. So basically, interlocking system of one among the railway track was changed and it was not duly communicated to the loco pilot of another train. And as a result of this, the collision happened in Balasore, Odisha. So these are, when you combine the infrastructural defect with the human error, with the signaling failures, that is when you will see the classic case of railway tragedies in India. So what can we do about it? First of all is to enhance safety by enhancing the amount of funds that we are giving to it. By enhancing the amount of fund, what we will be able to do? First of all, we will be able to bolster the infrastructure. The railway tracks can be made more strengthened. The second one, so first of all is the infrastructure which can be augmented, it can be strengthened. Second, we can provide more training to the existing manpower. Third, we can also induce certain technological advancements, for example, inducing IoT systems, artificial intelligence system, machine learning algorithms, etc., so that it can be heavily automated in order to manage freight and passenger traffic up to 100% of its carrying capacity. So first of all is to enhance the fund. And in 2017, the Indian government also made an effort named as the Rashtriya Rail Sanraksha Kosh, which is basically a fund with a corpus of 1 lakh crore rupees. And if we will be able to completely utilize it and augment this fund with more amount of corpus, we will definitely be able to bridge the loopholes of many areas of railways. Next is to adapt the advanced technologies. Now, before understanding what is level crossing, please understand that there are certain advanced technologies. For example, the anti-collision system, which can give us pre-warning. For example, the Kavach system installed in India is a kind of anti-collision only. The second one is automatic warnings and control systems. Automatic warning and control are required because with automation, we enhance the efficiency of the infrastructure, efficiency of the vehicle operation, and we also reduce the errors, especially coming as the human errors. In order to minimize these human errors, we need to automate it more, especially the control part of it, especially the warnings and the control part of it, so that proper communication and control happens. The next one is ultrasonic flaw detection system. How to figure out the flaws that are penetrating inside the railway tracks and the coaches, and how to basically update the railway staff about it. For that, we would be requiring interventions, for example, IoT, for example, UV rays. So they will be able to detect these minor holes or these minor cracks in the tracks of railways, and then with the help of IoT technology they will be able to update the staff about it so that appropriate maintenance can be taken. Next is GPS based fog pass device. Why do we need to navigate through the fog? In order to deal away with the visibility problem that is also seen by airways and by railways and other vehicles. So we would be requiring a fog pass device, etc. Right? Some of the best practices which have been taken in line of advancing technology in railway can be derived from UK and can be derived from the example of Japan, which is heavily earthquake prone. In order to understand the scenario of Japan, this is an area where railway operations are very fast, but at the same time, they have a very efficient early warning system because they know that a lot of earthquakes would be coming. The only way we can safeguard ourselves is by providing proper communication at the right time so that we have early warning system. The next one is by UK. So this is train protection and warning system by the UK and European train control system. This very efficiently communicates all the department. It basically causes inter-coordination between all the departments associated with railways and disaster management in order to reduce any kind of errors and mishaps. And this is the reason why after adoption of these protection and warning systems, UK was successfully capable of reducing the accidents up to 25%. So these are some of the best practices that India can also adopt via technology transfer. Next is to eliminate the level crossing. Now this is an infrastructural issue which is observed across the India. Let us understand what is level crossing. Level crossing is nothing when two planes or when two lanes, the pedestrian lane where the people and the vehicles are moving and the railway lane, both of them are at perpendicular to each other at a singular plane. So these are the planes, these are known as the level crossings where majority of the accidents take place. As you can see from the data that it holds the third most highest reason for why the railway accidents are happening. So therefore, how do we need to manage this? We need to reconstruct the infrastructure in such a way that the railway lines are either created overbridged or underbridged. In this way, we can avoid the level planation of both the planes. I hope this is clear. Next is, of course, human resource management by upskilling them, by training them, by reskilling them. That is required. With the help of fund, we will be able to achieve this. But not only that, we require performance linked incentive, because why would you perform ethically if you are not incentivized for the same? Or rather, if you are threatened for the same, why would you perform the ethical thing? Why would you communicate the loopholes of the railway to the upper hierarchy if you are threatened? So therefore, Vinod Rai committee in 2015 has recommended performance linked incentive scheme for the railway staff, especially working at the lower hierarchy. Next is recommended by Bibek Debaroy committee in 2014 is basically to outsource the non-core work of railways. For example, managing establishments like railways, managing establishments like platforms and shops, etc. All of this can be outsourced to private departments. For example, the Habibganj railway station. It follows a very good public-private mode partnership, the Kamlapati station that you know right now. So this is how we can outsource the non-core activities so that the core activities revolving around ensuring safety of infrastructure, that can be taken up by PSUs. Okay. Next is the CIRUS system, or the Confidential Incident Reporting and Analysis System. This is more like whistleblower protection for the railway staff so that they will be able to confidently and fearlessly communicate about the railway mishap, if any, to the higher authority. So this is already there in UK, and India also needs to adopt something in this line. The next one is to create a statutory authority, because we know that with regards to railway security, a lot of departments are there. But what is lagging is coordination. Lack of coordination is one essential issue among all the government agencies. So how to ensure? We need to have one statutory authority which is empowered enough to, first of all, create standardized rules and regulations across the railway boards. The second one is it is able to create safety audits so that we can take some preemptive measures for the safety. It will also be able to ensure the compliance because it will be having certain penalizing powers as well. And finally, in order to ensure coordination between all the departments related with the railway security of India. And this is how we will be able to avoid incidences that have happened in Balasore, Odisha, and recently in UP. Now, upon analyzing the railway safety scenario in India, I want you to answer this practice question where you have to analyze the major causes and consequences of railway accidents in India with reference to specific incidents. So do not forget to catch up some of the incidences and give them in reference, especially the recent ones. Next, suggest measures to improve the railway safety. Here, do not forget to mention the reports and the committees which we have just now read. This will help you to leverage your score more with regards to this question. Now, let's come to the next one. Our next topic is a very interesting one. Here, we are going to read about a very prevalent phenomenon in India, which is superstition. And we are going to analyze whether we have the enough laws to combat this superstition or not. This is in line of the context of the recent Hathras stampede, which is driven by superstitious beliefs. And this has reignited the debate on whether India has adequate legislation to address the exploitative religious and superstitious beliefs or not. Why is it important for the exam? Because it is going to deal with the Indian society, which is there in the GS1 syllabus. Then issues related to vulnerable section, because superstitions mar the lives especially of the tribal people and the women. Then the government policies and interventions that have been taken duly in this regard. First of all, what exactly do we mean by superstition? Superstition is an irrational belief upon a supernatural power for which we do not have any scientific argument, or we have not created any scientific temperament or rational argument yet. So, without any reasoning, or rather scientific reasoning, if we start taking up any activity backed by any belief which is primarily based on ignorance and fear, then that is what we call as superstition. Here you can see a lot of areas where we follow the superstitions. Now, what is the difference between superstition and black magic? Both of them are not the same. Black magic is a manifestation of superstition. So when you have this profound amount of reverence about the supernatural power, and you start using the supernatural power to do the malicious act, that is when it is considered to be a black magic, or also called as witchcraft. All of these things are very relevant, not just in India but across the different parts of the world, because human can lose the sensibility at the drop of a hat. Talking about the superstition scenario in India, we all eat the sweet curd before attempting any examination. Well, that is a kind of superstition itself. We want to throw away the coins in the ponds and the wells and the rivers in order to have a particular wish granted. That is also a kind of superstition only. Now, talking about the plague that the superstition has created in India, according to the NCRB report, in the modern times, in fact, in 2021 only, about 70 deaths were directly associated with the witchcraft killing, and many of them were injured because of the superstitious beliefs. So please understand, superstition beliefs, though they are coming from the religion, but they are not religious practices. They are not scientific practices. So whenever you start following up anything just on the basis of beliefs, try to question it on the grounds of rationality and reasoning. Now, talking about NCRB finding again, state with the most amount of witchcraft killings and the most amount of superstitious practices is Chhattisgarh, followed by MP, followed by Telangana. So basically, majorly followed by the tribal population in India. Next up, we will analyze the multiple causes which leads to the creation of superstition and its manifestation. First and foremost is the kind of culture in which we are living in. If our peers, our ancestors, if the people around us are telling us to have a Nibu Mirchi on any property that we purchase, we will start doing it just in order to have compliance of their orders, out of respect many a times, out of fear and ignorance many other times. So first is the kind of culture people live in. Second is the kind of society they are a part of. The society has this intrinsic belief that in order to get your wishes fulfilled, you have to visit a particular Baba or a particular temple. Each one of us will start moving towards them. Why? Because we are not using best of our judgments. Second is the kind of society we live in. Third is the fear of being outcasted. Even if many of us dare to question these beliefs, we will fear that if we don't adhere to these two beliefs, we might be outcasted from the society, and end of the day, we all are social beings. We want to live harmoniously. So people start adhering to the same norms. Last but not the least is the lack of education. India, the modern India, still is not having 100% literacy. This is even bad for the poorer and the vulnerable population, for example, the tribals and the women, which are most prone and suspicious towards getting the superstitious activities and beliefs penetrated in their soft minds. So basically, these could be some of the causes. Now, what are the related laws in India? You will be surprised to know that though this is a great menace, we do not still have a centralized law for dealing with witchcraft and associated deaths in India. Also, we should know that as citizens of India, it is a very intrinsic fundamental duty in accordance with Article 51A, Clause H, that it is our duty to develop scientific temperament towards approaching any belief or faith. Next is IPC has also got some of the laws which are indirectly dealing with the suspicious killings related to witchcraft, etc. For example, section 302 and section 295A of IPC, it deals with such issues. Second is the Drug and the Magic Remedies Act, so it also deals with the issues or the mishaps that can be created by the magic remedies out of superstitions. And then we also were about to promulgate a bill which got lapsed in the Lok Sabha. This was 2016 Prevention of Witch Hunting Bill. It is still not seen the light of the day as a full throttle legislation, but these are some of the areas where India has tried to endeavor. You will also be happy to see that many of the states are the most prominent legislators of witchcraft associated killings in India. And first of all was the Bihar state. It was the first state to enact a law like that. Then there was Maharashtra, there was Kerala, there was Karnataka, there was Chhattisgarh also. So these were some of the states, but please remember there's still not any central law regarding to witchcraft and associated killing. So what is the need of centralized act? First and foremost, it violates the very fundamental right. Yes, you can practice religious beliefs and it is guaranteed under Article 25 and 26. But what about the Article 14 and what about the Article 21 and what about the Article 19 of you and the other citizens of India? That will be violated if you will start doing things which can cause malicious attempts on the other people's life. So first of all, it has to be there to safeguard the fundamental right of all the people uniformly. Second, to violate several provisions of various international legislations. Have we not already signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant of Civil and Political Right, the elimination of all forms of discrimination? If we have already signed it, how are we practicing witchcraft associated activities? So therefore, we have to be in line with our international affiliations also. Next is detrimental effect on the public order and health of the citizens. As seen in this graph itself, you can see that there has been rise of up to 160 people who have been died because of witchcraft related killing and superstitious beliefs, and some stampedes, for example, and such Hathras incidents have also taken place because of such superstitious beliefs. So therefore, it should be a very important priority for the government to have a centralized, uniform and standardized act in order to deal with this menace. What can be the way forward? First and foremost, only governmental legislations will not help us. The main thing starts from the literacy, from the mindset of the people, and that is something we are going to target. First of all, we have to bring in literacy, and not just literacy but qualitative education which teaches people to question things on the basis of reasoning, rationality and scientific temperament. Most importantly, it should be there for women and the tribal and the rural areas which are most susceptible to the witchcraft related hunting. Next is raising awareness of the people, more so of the societies, and this can be done by civil society organizations, for example some of the NGOs who have been very active in this regard. This basically changes the societal consciousness about a particular belief, asks them to question it, tells them their implication, and finally they will be able to bring a behavioral change into the lives of people. Finally, separating religion from the blind beliefs. Many of the beliefs that you and me have today are because of the religious affiliations, but we need to question them time and again, especially when we are living in the modern India. So could you now practice this question? Try to attempt. Superstitions continue to have significant impact on various aspects of Indian society. Discuss the socio-economic and cultural implications of superstitions in India along with giving examples. You all must have by now heard about the National Afforestation Program, the Campa Act and the 1 billion tree initiative. But do you know that there are many fallouts of these tree planting initiatives, which is going to be the line of discussion in this editorial analysis taken up in order to highlight the degradation and the restoration of forest landscapes, which needs to be dealt in detail. Why are we reading about this? Because in India, the first week of July is celebrated as the Tree Plantation Week. And this was initiated in 1950 for the first time by the then Agriculture Minister K.M. Munshi. And therefore, in order to revisit and review our afforestation policies, we are going to do this policy analysis. But before that, what is the magnanimity of forest degradation in the world? You must know that out of all the area of the world, 26% is hosted by the forest. Forests are so important for us because it hosts 70% of the total biodiversity. But of late, especially since the beginning of 20th century, it can be seen that 13 million hectares of the forest lands have been lost. We were and we have taken up a lot of afforestation activities across the globe, but they could only recover only 6 hectares till now. So only 6 hectares have been restored. What have been the reasons behind it? The reasons of this unsustainable degradation has been unsustainable urbanization, a lot of agricultural, especially the monoculture cultivation activities, then waterlogging, grazing, clearing the forest for grazing activities, for rearing agriculture and cattle, and also unintentional forest fires were one of the reasons why the forests were getting depleted. And the problem is not just their depletion, but the lack of their restoration, which has led to a lot of problems, including rise in the greenhouse gases, including lack of sequestration of these gases, including loss of biodiversity. So, first of all, let us have an overlook of the tree plantation and the need of afforestation. Afforestation is required because about 10 million squares of the forest have already been degraded by us humans since the beginning of 20th century. You want to imagine this 10 million square kilometers worth of area? Well, imagine the continent of Europe. It is equivalent to this much area completely gone degraded. The second reason why we need afforestation initiatives is because of our overarching target. We are currently running through the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which started from 2021, is going to last till 2030. And the target that we have is mostly regarding and revolving around the restoration of the degraded forest lands. How much is the target, you ask? So first of all is to restore about 350 million hectares of the degraded land, and also ensure that these are going to provide us $9 trillion worth of ecosystem servicing, and it is going to sequester the greenhouse gases worth 13 to 26 gigatons. This is the target of United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, spanning from across these years. Now, the afforestation programs that are very successfully running across the globe are 1 trillion project by World Economic Forum. Please remember them from the for prelims point of view and also for quoting them in the mains answers. Second is the Great Green Wall of China. Next is the 10 billion tree tsunami initiative of Pakistan, the Born Challenge taken up by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification to restore the 350 million hectare by 2030. Because India is a signatory to this Born Challenge, we have committed to restore about 26 million hectare of the land by ourselves. For that, we have taken up multiple efforts. The first and foremost started with, first of all, the Vanotsav, which was started by K.M. Munshi, celebrated in the first week of July to take up and to celebrate the reforestation efforts. Second is the National Afforestation Program, which was taken up by the National Afforestation and Eco Development Board. So this was the first program that we had. Second, in 2016, we had Compensatory Afforestation Management Act as well, which basically started taking up all the afforestation compensatory activities, where the company who is doing the afforestation will be made to give some amount of fund, 90% of which will be given to the states and 10% will be kept with the center. Okay, so this is basically compensatory fund in order to afforest the deforested land. Then aerial seeding methods have been used. So basically we kind of coat the seeds with the clay in order to provide them protection. We lift them off and then we spread them aerially and then we finally grow them. This helps in reforestation to a massive scale. We already see a lot of efforts from global level and Indian level. But then what are the criticism which has been put in light by this particular editorial? First of all is the limited community participation. How many times have you yourself have gone to some place and grown trees? Could be very, very rare. Why? Because such kind of behavioral dynamics has not been penetrated via our policies till now. When you talk about the 1 billion initiative, it is majorly governmental backed initiative of WEF. It is not specifically done by the people itself. So if the people are not generating that consciousness, it becomes very difficult to achieve such a gigantic target of restoring 350 billion hectare of land. Right? First is limited community participation. Second is inadequate post-plantation care. Yes, you have grown the trees, but who will take care of the plantation? It's whose responsibility, because people are kept aloof of the reforestation. So therefore, post-plantation care is also one of the policy loopholes observed. Second is the ecological concern. The entire focus is to increase the amount of quantity with which we are growing the trees, which means we will start growing trees which are non-usufruct. Non-usufruct, which means those trees which are not of that much utility to us. And for example, eucalyptus. You can see that a lot of eucalyptus trees have been grown across the beds of Narmada, across the beds of Ganga, and they're actually causing more harm than good to the environment. Why they have been grown? Because they grow very, very quickly. So it makes us believe, it makes the people believe, and the other organizations believe that the government has fulfilled its target. But the idea is to have good amount of trees, is to appreciate the diversity across the trees. So first of all, promotion of monoculture can be seen especially in the Great Wall of China initiative. Only a single species has been grown throughout. This compromises with the very biodiversity. Second, disruption of the native ecosystem. Let's say a place has got grassland ecosystem. Grassland ecosystem will have the people or will have the animal species, the avian species, which will be accustomed to that grassland initiative. You cannot grow the trees over them in order to disrupt the ecosystem. So this kind of disruptions can be seen, especially in the grassland areas. Next is use of invasive species, for example, eucalyptus. For example, lantana camera, that has also been used in India. You can see it prevalent across your roads. Next is the rising amount of wildfires. You have seen already it in New Zealand, in Australia, and many parts of India, especially Himalayas. So rising wildfires are also one of the prominent reasons as to why we are losing the forest, and this area is not covered in any of the afforestation policy yet. So therefore, these are some of the criticism which needs to be dealt. And what is going to be the way forward? Now, the way forward will be three-tiered. First of all, is to have the policy amendments or policy changes in line of the highlighted limitations in order to fix those loopholes. The second is public participation. How will you ensure public participation? Just like how we read in the railway one. First of all, you have to incentivize them for behaving rightly. So incentivizing public for growing the trees could be a good way forward. Second is to bring the energy of social media. That will also help. Is to have more amount of civil society organizations working in this direction. Then is to harness personality figures who can help induce such behavioral change in the mindsets of public so that they can themselves start growing the trees and start maintaining them. Also, what is important is the post-plant management. So this will also be taken care of by these two tiers. And third and the most important one is finances. If you devolve the right amount of money, just like how we saw in the railway one, you will be able to bring in finances, you will be able to bring resources for fulfilling the targets that we have set for the year 2030. So I hope that this topic is clear to you. Now you will try to practice this particular question where you have to critically analyze the large-scale tree planting drives in India, discuss with example the main challenges these initiatives face and suggest measures to improve their effectiveness. This is going to be a 15 marker. Our next topic is very important from prelims and mains point of view. We are going to read about a constitutional body, the Finance Commission. So the context is the 16th Finance Commission headed by Arvind Pangaria has begun its work by inviting suggestions from the public on the mandates set for it by the centre. When was it constituted? It was constituted in December last year. And it is all about to set the stage. Why? Because the time of 15th Finance Commission is going to end in 2025. Now, this is going to talk about cooperative federalism, constitutional bodies and centre-state relations, part of the syllabus. It's important for both prelims and mains point of view. But we will be focusing primarily on the prelims aspect. Talking about the basics first. Finance Commission is the linchpin of the fiscal federalism in the India. It is a constitutional body backed by Article 280 of the Indian Constitution. 281 also talks about the Finance Commission. It is a non-permanent body. Why? Because it is constituted by the President time to time. So it is a non-permanent unless it is called upon by the President for constitution. Next, it's a quasi-judicial body because the number of people that it contains, a part of it has to be belonging to High Court or belonging to a judicial process. So this is a constitutional body. Now talking about the composition, it primarily composes of 5 people. 5 people, one including the chairperson, should be of a person of having public expertise, public domain expertise, and the other 4, in which one should be judge of High Court, one should be the expert in financial administration, another one expert in finance and accounts, and one expert in economics. So all of these qualifications are nowhere mentioned in the constitution. They were to be decided by the parliament, which got decided by the Finance Commission Act of 1951. Are they eligible for reappointment? Absolutely yes. So unlike the other constitutional bodies where reappointment is not that easy, in this particular case reappointment can be made. Okay. Now what are the functions? There are 2 types of broad functions. First of all is the vertical devolution, that is how much amount of tax revenue should be divided between the center and the constituent federal units, which is the state. So this is the vertical devolution. And the second one is horizontal devolution, as to how much amount of this booty has to be divided among the different states. That is horizontal. Both of them are taken care by the Finance Commission. You must also know that this vertical devolution from center to states, it has been rising. In the 13th Finance Commission, it was only about 32%, which means 32% was given to the state, rest was kept with the center. In the 14th Finance Commission, it grew to 10%, so by 10 points, so now it became 42%. And the currently running Finance Commission has given this devolution up to 41%, reduced it by 1%. This question was asked in UPSC prelims exam. Now please understand that this is the amount of money that the state is getting, and this formula, this revenue sharing formula, is created by Finance Commission. Are these policies or are these suggestions, these revenue sharing policy, have to be mandatorily followed up or adhered by the central government? The answer is no, because it is only advisory. It is only advisory in nature. Okay. Second one is the horizontal devolution. So which state would be getting how much amount of money? That depends upon certain parameters, and it keeps changing with every Finance Commission. Let's say, for example, in 14th Finance Commission, there were about 4 parameters. First of all, income distance, forest and ecology, area, and population. But from 15th Finance Commission, one more parameter was added. That was the amount of tax effort that the state is taking in order to boost its revenue collection. So that, along with demographic performance, along with population, area, forest ecology, and income distance. So which one is having majority of the share in this booty? This is, in this parameter list, this is income distance. Okay. So these are the different revenue sharing formula, and it keeps on changing. It also provides grant in aid. Grant in aid in the form of, let's say there is some centrally sponsored scheme, or let's say some particular state is having a special category status, so they have to be provided more amount of money. So such extra grant in aid for more vulnerable states or specially recognized states will also be provided by a formula created by Finance Commission. Next is fund for the local body is also the responsibility of Finance Commission. Evaluating the disaster management financing and how much should be done, that is also analyzed by Finance Commission. So these are basically the functions, the terms of references which are followed by the Finance Commissions. What are the challenges now? First of all, as I've told you, the devolution has always been less than 50% for the states. Of course, states retaliate against this because they feel that most of the things, for example, the healthcare, the education, these are all belonging to the state list, which have to be dealt by us. For that, we should be given majority of the chunk and not the center. So first of all, states demand for greater share in the fund. Second, they also demand that the cesses and surcharges which are not shared by the center to the states, they should be shared equally. Next is actualized fund is less than the recommended. This amount of devolution, let's say 41%, is not actually represented in the ground reality. It might happen that central government, because this is just a non-advisory body, so therefore central government might give less than 30% also. So there is no mandatory adherence to this reviewed policy or this reviewed formula. Next is poor penetration at the local bodies. Do you know, when it comes to China, they devolve around 30% of the total revenue to the local bodies, because they know that the development has to be decentralized, but this is not so in the case of India. In fact, we devolve our local bodies very poorly, less than 5%. In fact, it is just about 3% of the total amount of revenue that is generated in India. All these challenges have to be now dealt by the upcoming 16th Finance Commission, focusing more on empowering the local bodies at the financial level. So now you can try to practice this previous year question which is asked by UPSC in 2018. How is the Finance Commission of India constituted? What do you know about the terms of reference of the recently constituted Finance Commission? What are these terms of reference? These are these exact powers, it is these exact functions that the Finance Commission delivers. Niti Aayog has come up with a very interesting report. It is named as Electronics Powering India's Participation in the Global Value Chain. It has highlighted what all things have to be done by the India in order to become a semiconductor and electronics superpower and have a very prominent share in the global value chain. So Niti Aayog has suggested measures to revitalize the electronics sector in India, and this is important from GS3 point of view, where we have to read about industrial sector growth and development. First of all, how is the electronics sector currently performing in India? First of all, you will be happy to know we are going through a phase of rapid growth in electronics. In the last 1 decade, we have grown up to 35%, reaching $155 billion worth annual turnover of the electronic sector by the fiscal year 23. We have also therefore reduced the reliance on the smartphone import. How much is it reduced? Up to 99% of the manufacturing is now happening on a self-reliant mode. It is done on India only. It is done domestically only and not imported from anywhere. Next is about the global electronics market which we are competing with. It is primarily South Korea, China, Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia and USA as well. So these are our prominent competitors. There are various initiatives taken up by the government which you should know. First of all, and the most important one, 100% FDI is allowed through automatic route in the normal electronic sector. But when you talk about the defense electronics, because it is used in making satellite missiles, etc. So in defense electronics, up to 49%, there will be automated entry of FDI. But after 49%, it will be allowed only via governmental route. Some of the other schemes, you have already heard about the PLI scheme. There are 2 PLI schemes working to leverage the electronic sector. First of all is large-scale electronics manufacturing, and second one is for the IT hardware. Both of them are working to boost the electronics. Next is the SPECS scheme, which is basically for promotion of the electronics component, that is also taken up by the Government of India. Next is cluster-based manufacturing of the electronic products. So the modified electronics manufacturing cluster scheme, the Semicon India, in order to create India as a global hub for semiconductor manufacturing, because if only we have our hands on the semiconductor, we will be able to leverage, we will be able to justify the electronics industry. So Semicon India is for bringing awareness, an annual meeting, annual program. Next is Digital India, Make in India, phased manufacturing program. All of these have contributed to our rapid growth in the electronic sector. We still have a long way to go, and that has been suggested through the highlights of this report, which you can use in your mains answers. First of all, it has revealed a target. A target should be to reach up to an annual turnover of 500 billion USD in the electronics manufacturing sector. Till now, we were only doing the assembly part, but now it wants us to move towards the manufacturing sector so that we become more self-reliant by 2030. Next is to have strategic interventions which are needed to achieve these goals. For example, to bring more amount of R&D, to bring more amount of technology transfer, to promote the component and capital goods manufacturing, to promote design innovations in India, for again which we would require funds in order to have R&D. Then tariff rationalization, because India is one country which suffers from very high input price for semiconductors and electronics. Why? Because of very high import tariffs. Next is skilling initiatives in order to reskill, upskill and build the skills of the upcoming talent. It also will help us to provide more employment, and it also helps us to facilitate the technology transfer. Some other highlights emphasize on scaling up the production, in some of the segments. First of all, mobile phones, we are already doing very great in that, so we would like to leverage that. Second is establishing foothold in the component manufacturing. Okay, next is expediting the visa approvals for the professional so that it doesn't causes brain drain, so that the best of the talent across the world would be able to come inside India and work for our technology industry. Next is localize the high-tech components and forge strategic partnership with the global leader to facilitate easy technology transfer. These are some of the highlight of the reports which you can use as a suggestion in your mains answer in order to give a boost to the semiconductor and the electronics industry vis-a-vis. Now quickly moving on to our next segment, which is prelim snippets. Here we will be covering 4 topics in hand. First of all, tobacco epidemic. Next is the National Disaster Response Force. Next, maize revolution, and the largest uncontacted tribe of the world, Mashco Piro. Coming to the first one, tobacco and the tobacco crop. You must know that we are one of the largest consumers and producers of tobacco, but it is not native to India, not even to Southeast Asia. It is native to the Peruvian Andes mountain ranges. So basically it is coming from the Amazonia region, from the Native America. From there, in 16th century, it came to Europe, and from there it came to India, especially with the coming of Vasco da Gama. So Portuguese have been credited for bringing the tobacco to India and making a lot of people addicted to it. What is the chemical substance which causes this addiction? This is the high amount of nicotine. The debate of this particular topic of this tobacco epidemic would be as to how we can use technologies like CRISPR so that we can do the gene editing of tobacco, and we can reduce and minimize this nicotine content in the crop itself, so that it doesn't causes a lot of harmful ailments, for example, cancers, cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, etc. Because it is one of the largest life killer in and across the world, especially in India. Now, you must know that the Tobacco Board is a statutory body which takes care of the tobacco regulation in India. It was formed in 1975. Its headquarters is in Andhra Pradesh district, Guntur. Talking about India's status, it was brought by Vasco da Gama, Portuguese sailor, and about 0.27% of the total net cultivated area is grown under tobacco only. When it comes to our ranking, as a producer, we are ranking second after China, and as exporter, we are ranking second after Brazil. It is contributing as 2% of our total agri exports. It is also one of the biggest menace. We are not able to replace this crop because of huge dependency. It actually hampers a lot of employment if we will remove tobacco cultivation from India. It employs more than 45 million people. So therefore, it will lead to huge amount of unemployment crisis if we completely phase out the tobacco industry. And that is why there's an ongoing debate between 2 prominent agencies. One, the ICAR, which takes care of the agriculture research, and second is the medical research organization, Indian Council for Medical Research, ICMR. ICMR says that we should completely evacuate the tobacco cultivation from India, but ICAR opposes this, saying that this will lead to vast scale unemployment and economic crisis in India. So eventually, what we can do, if we want to grow it, at least we can gene edit it with the help of technologies, for example, CRISPR, so that this nicotine content can be washed away. Now, talking about the areas and the states which are producing tobacco, it is very similar to those which are producing maize. So you can see that these are the states, Gujarat ranking first and Andhra Pradesh ranking second, and of late, Andhra Pradesh has been the one producing a lot of tobacco. So in the Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh is where we see the tobacco board located. Can you tell me the ministry under which this tobacco board comes? Kindly write it down in the comment section. Next one is a primary disaster response force, which has helped evacuation and saving lives of a lot of Indians across different disasters since its inception. This is a statutory body backed by National Disaster Management Act of 2005, which was followed up by a lot of tsunamis, especially the 2004 tsunami of India. So this is the primary disaster management authority comprising of 12 battalions from across the sources, from across the different forces of India, comprising of about 1200 personnel. Who is the chairman? NDRF, though it comes under NDMA, and NDMA is headed by our Prime Minister, but this organization, because it is force-led organization, it is headed by an IPS rank DG. So it is headed by a Director General who should be having the qualifications of being an IPS officer. Can civilians directly enter into NDRF? No, it is only allowed for the deputational officers. So civilians cannot have direct entry into NDRF. This you must remember. It has not only helped India against many disasters, but also some international aids have also been provided in the case of Nepal earthquake and Japan tsunami. And this one is under the Ministry of Home Affairs. What are the different objectives of NDRF? First of all, to have a promptive response to the disaster, pre-deployment in disaster threatening situation, deployment in case of disaster, training the state disaster response force, and also community capacity building. So basically it manages multiple stakeholders, trains them, and also takes preemptive actions. Next is the golden crop. This is the maize revolution. Why it is touted as a revolution in India? Because of late we can see in the last decade it has grown to up to 200%. The amount of crop of maize that we have grown. What are the growth condition becomes important for prelims. So the growth condition, it requires temperature. It basically is a tropical as well as subtropical crop. So it can grow in temperature variation of 21 to 27 degrees centigrade, requires a lot of sunshine, but requires only moderate amount of rainfall, which means up to 100 centimeters. It requires well-drained fertile soils, majorly the alluvial soil. So definitely it will be grown in the alluvial plains of India. It will be grown over here. It will also be grown in the other areas where the temperature condition is suited. So it is mostly grown in the northern, in the central and the western parts of India. Now the major producers, Karnataka ranks first and then comes Madhya Pradesh. What is the India's rank? India's rank is third in maize production. It is topped by USA and second is China. Then Maize Research Center, just like we have a research center for tea, we have a board for coffee, we have a board for tobacco, we have a research center for rice also. Can you please name the research center for rice in India? Anyway, the maize research is located in Ludhiana. Okay, the disease that are caused by maize or that are caused in the maize crops are leaf blight, foliar and common rust. Is it included in the MSP regime of India? Absolutely yes. So it is included and a part of MSP. In the last topic, we will learn about the most primitive and uncontacted tribes of the world, very less heard of, but they have been ailing because of the deforestation and their forced migrations. So one such that we are going to read right now is the Mashco Piro. Mashco Piro is the largest of the all uncontacted tribes recorded in the world. It is situated near the Amazon rainforest, which makes me tell to you a lot of other tribes. The Sentinelese tribes, the PVTGs of India, they are also one of the largest uncontacted tribe. They live in India and they are primarily hunters and gatherers. They become very violent towards outsiders. So therefore, the areas inhabited by them, they are left aloof. Next is the Yaifu. Yaifu belongs to Papua New Guinea. Next is Kawahiva of Brazil. The Mashco Peru of Peru region, primarily belonging to the Amazon rainforest region. The Ayoreo of Paraguay, the Avas of Brazil, the Palawan of Philippines. So kindly take notes of these uncontacted tribes and also remember that there's a pattern. Most of them are there in the heavily forested areas. So what if we cause the afforestation? So what if we do a lot of deforestation? We will primarily affect and threaten their livelihoods and their very lives. So thank you so much. It was all about today and have a nice day.